Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so excited to share this one with you. Today, we're diving into the history of flying saucers, but we're doing it through an incredibly revealing, totally objective lens. We're stepping back from the conspiracy theories, the die-hard believers, and the debunkers, and instead, we're going to look at the cold, hard history of how this massive global phenomenon actually took shape.
Okay, let's dive right into this with a brilliant quote from the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. He said, "Things are seen in the sky, but we don't know what." This perfectly establishes the paradigm shift we need for this explainer. You see, we aren't here today to prove whether aliens exist or not. Instead, we're here to study the human reaction to the unknown.
Section 1. The Historian's Lens. Objectivity over Sensationalism. To guide us through this, we're drawing on the fascinating work of U.S. historian Greg Ejijian. As a historian of science and medicine, his approach is to neutrally chronicle how institutions, governments, and just everyday people have talked about and debated this subject over the decades. But to really understand his objective approach, we need a little semantic precision right off the bat. A sighting is just an experience, right? It's someone seeing something weird in the sky. But we know the vast majority of people never tell officials about what they saw. Historians, however, have to rely on reports. A report is a documented event written down by an institution, a UFO group, or the authorities. That physical document is what historians can actually study.
And even the language we use to document these reports completely shapes the narrative. Take the term UFO, unidentified flying object. It sounds incredibly precise and scientific, right? Well, it was actually created to replace the highly biased and frankly slightly silly term flying saucer. But here's the thing. UFO still carries its own inherent biases. The words flying and object actually problematically imply piloting, structure, and intelligent design.
Section 2. The True Origin Story. Busting the Roswell Myth.
So the crucial point here is that to understand this history, we have to bust the biggest myth in UFO lore. And that's the idea that it all started with a crashed spaceship in Roswell, New Mexico. Let's actually walk through the chronological timeline, because the real history totally subverts our expectations. It actually kicks off in June 1947. A private pilot named Kenneth Arnold is flying around Washington state and spots these strange pan-shaped objects. He lands, tells authorities they flew like a saucer skipping over water, and boom, an enterprising journalist instantly coins the term flying saucer. But what about Roswell? Well, Roswell happened a few weeks later in July 1947, but it was just a minor two-day blip in the media. It was completely forgotten about for decades until the late 1970s. So it was actually a private pilot and a journalist who kicked off the entire craze.
And man, that craze caught on with unprecedented speed. Within just 6 weeks of Kenneth Arnold's sighting, surveys showed that 9 out of 10 Americans had heard the brand new term flying saucer. 9 out of 10. This was a literal, viral, cultural explosion decades before the internet even existed.
Section 3. Pop culture and shifting shapes, from monsters to gray aliens.
Let's shift our focus a bit to how the details of these reports evolved over time, because the early days were wildly inconsistent. Back in the 1940s and 50s, people weren't just seeing that standard gray alien we all know today. They reported little men under 12 inches tall, large, hairy, Sasquatch-like monsters, robotic entities, and even gorgeous beings that looked like fashion models. And this brilliantly illustrates that before pop culture eventually homogenized our idea of what an alien looks like, human imagination was just pulling from absolutely every direction.
Now, speaking of pop culture, you'd probably assume that blockbuster UFO movies would cause massive spikes in people looking up at the sky and reporting new sightings, right? But historical facts actually contrast heavily with our expectations here. For example, Steven Spielberg's 1977 hit Close Encounters of the Third Kind didn't actually cause an uptick in new sightings at all. Instead, it just triggered people to come forward and share old memories of things they thought they saw years prior. And E.T. in 1982, it counterintuitively triggered a downward trend in UFO sightings in the UK. Absolutely fascinating.
Section 4. The Cold War Catalyst. The real reason for the craze.
So, if blockbuster movies weren't driving these massive surges, what was? Let's transition into the geopolitical shadow that actually fueled the global spread of this phenomenon. And I want to ask you directly, why 1947? Why did the modern concept of the alien visitors supposedly show up in 1947 and not, say, 5 years earlier or 500 years earlier?
Well, the answer historians point to is this: the atomic bomb and Cold War anxiety. The UFO as we know it is literally unimaginable without the Cold War. The working theory driving the craze at the time was that humanity had just unlocked the key to atomic energy, making us a qualitatively different species, and this triggered profound global anxiety.
People genuinely believed that aliens had seen the atomic explosions and were either terrified for us or terrified of us. So 1947 was just the perfect psychological breeding ground for these reports.
And that anxiety went global, but in a really specific way. The United States acted as the central hub, basically triggering the news everywhere else. But notice where the high activity was. The UK, France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and Argentina, while places like Germany were completely muted. Why is that? Well, it turns out the spread of the phenomenon was driven less by actual events happening in the sky and much more by the infrastructure of civilian UFO groups on the ground. If a country had sustainable civilian organizations ready to study and publicize these narratives, the sightings skyrocketed. It's like the infrastructure created the phenomenon, not the other way around.
Section 5. Why we play detective. The psychology of belief.
Knowing that so much of this is driven by culture and organizations, you kind of have to wonder why people dedicate their entire lives to investigating these reports. Now, what's really interesting about this is it all comes down to this massive number, 95%. Even the most serious UFO investigators, the true diehard believers, openly admit that 95% or more of sightings are easily explained. They're just mundane things like Chinese lanterns floating in the wind or a string of Starlink satellites reflecting sunlight. So why keep looking if almost everything is easily explained away?
Historian Greg Aikijian hits the nail on the head with this quote. It's really not altogether different from your favorite true crime podcast where everybody's invited to chime in and crack the case. The true motivation for so many believers is just the thrill of the hunt. It's the ability to be a detective, hoping against hope that one day a case is going to come along that simply won't go away.
Section 6. UAPs in the modern era, from fringe groups to the Pentagon.
Let's move to the present day and see how this builds into our current reality, because we are in the midst of a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we've even changed the vocabulary from UFO to UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, just to strip away those old stigmas. And we've moved entirely out of the realm of fringe civilian groups. Just look at the steps. First, the U.S. Navy unequivocally confirms that recent pilot footage is real, it's not a computer glitch, and it is totally unexplained. Second, the Pentagon actively admits that they historically ridiculed pilots for reporting these things, which created a massive stigma. And third, NASA steps in and forms an independent civilian science panel to actually investigate the phenomenon seriously.
And guys, this is huge. For a historian, NASA's intervention is arguably the single most exciting development in this entire timeline. Why? Because it legitimizes civilian science. NASA isn't about classified military projects hidden in the dark. It's about open civilian research. It strips away decades of military stigma and finally invites scientists from all disciplines to have open, transparent conversations about what is actually happening in our skies.
Which leaves us with this final thrilling question. What will the next 5 to 10 years of institutional research uncover? Now that the conversation has evolved from wild pulp fiction monsters to serious, destigmatized scientific inquiry, how is this fascinating chapter of human history going to unfold next? I really hope this explainer gave you a clear, structured look at how we got here. Keep looking up, keep asking questions, and we will see you in the next explainer.